You don't belong with us anymore.
Daddy, what did I do wrong?
Mom, when are you coming back?
Before your birthday, sweetheart.
Promise?
Promise.
I was 8 years old the last time I saw my parents. My mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, while my father loaded 2 suitcases into the trunk of a blue sedan. He looked me straight in the eyes and promised they'd be back before my birthday. That birthday came and went. Then another. By the time I turned 24, I'd stopped counting the years and started counting the excuses I no longer believed. 16 years can change a person. It taught me how to survive without the people who were supposed to protect me. It taught me that strangers can become family, while blood can become nothing more than a memory. But nothing, not even 16 years, prepared me for the knock on my front door that changed everything. My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 24 years old, and until that knock on my door, I thought the hardest day of my life had already happened. You don't belong with us anymore, my father said. I was 8 years old when I heard those words. I didn't understand them then. I kept waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was a joke, to pick me up the way he always did when I got scared. But he didn't. He just turned around and walked toward the blue sedan, where my mother was already sitting, staring straight ahead like she couldn't bear to look at me. We'll come back for you before your birthday, she said through the window. I promise. I believed her. I was just Sarah, 8 years old, standing on that porch, watching the car disappear down the road until the dust settled and the street went quiet again. I told myself they'd be back in a few days. A week, maybe. Surely by my birthday. My birthday came. It went. No car. No knock on the door. No apology. I started sitting by the window every evening, the way you do when you're a child who still believes the world owes you an explanation. I watched headlights turn onto our street and my heart would leap, only to sink again when the car kept driving. I did this for months. Then years. Holidays became the hardest. Thanksgiving dinners where I set 2 extra plates out of habit, even after I stopped believing they'd be filled. Christmas mornings where I'd wake up and, for just a second, forget and then remember all over again. My birthday, every single year, was the cruelest reminder of all. A day that was supposed to be about being celebrated became a day about being forgotten. Nobody explained it to me. Not really. The neighbors whispered. Some said my parents ran into money trouble. Others said they just weren't cut out to be parents. Nobody knew the real reason, and back then, neither did I. All I knew was that I was 8 years old, alone in a house that no longer felt like a home, waiting for 2 people who had already made their decision the moment they drove away. I used to think the loneliness was the worst part. The confusion was worse. How do you explain to a child that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally simply left? I didn't have the words for it then. I'm not sure I fully have them now. I thought losing my parents would be the hardest thing I'd ever survive. I had no idea that the woman who would change my life forever was only hours away from knocking on that door. Her name was Margaret Lawson. She wasn't a relative. She wasn't a family friend. She was a woman who lived 3 streets over and ran a small, struggling bookstore that never seemed to have more than a handful of customers a day. I didn't know her name yet when she knocked on our door that first evening. I only knew that she was the first adult who looked at me and didn't look away. Later, I'd learned that Margaret had heard what happened through the same whispering neighbors who never did anything but talk. She said she couldn't sleep knowing a child was alone in that house. So she came. And when no one else stepped up, she asked if I needed somewhere to stay, just for the night, she said. That night turned into a week. That week turned into forever. I asked her once, years later, why she did it. Why a woman with barely enough income to keep her own store open would take on a child that wasn't hers. She just smiled and said, because somebody has to. And I decided it would be me. Margaret never tried to replace my parents. She never once asked me to call her mom. That word came on its own, years later, the first time I said it out loud without thinking, and she cried harder than I did. Life with Margaret was simple. Small. Honest. Her bookstore, Lawson's Books, sat on a quiet corner downtown, and most days it barely broke even. But she never let the struggle show on her face. She'd wake up before sunrise, unlock the front door herself, and greet every customer like they were the only reason the store existed. I spent my afternoons after school sitting behind the counter, sorting returns, learning how to talk to people, learning what it meant to actually care about the work you do. She taught me things no classroom ever could. Honesty, even when it cost you a sale. Hard work, even when nobody was watching. Kindness, especially toward the customers who could least afford to be kind back. She used to say, "The way you treat people when you have nothing to gain from it, that's who you really are." I grew up watching her give away books to kids who couldn't pay, extend credit to families going through hard times, and never once complain about the toll it took on her bottom line. She wasn't rich. She wasn't trying to be. She was just good, steadily, quietly, consistently good in a way I didn't fully appreciate until I was old enough to understand how rare that actually is. There were nights I still thought about my parents. Margaret never told me to stop. She just made sure I never had to face those thoughts alone. She'd sit with me on the porch some evenings, not saying much, just being there, until whatever storm was in my head passed. One evening, when I was a teenager, she said something that didn't make any sense to me at the time. We were closing up the store, and out of nowhere, she looked at me and said, "One day, someone from your past will come looking for you, but it won't be because they suddenly learned how to love." I laughed it off. I told her she was being dramatic. She just shook her head, turned the key in the lock, and said nothing more about it. I had no idea how right she would turn out to be. I grew up behind that counter. Somewhere between shelving books and ringing up sales, childhood turned into adulthood without me noticing exactly when it happened. By the time I was in my early 20s, Lawson's Books wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving. Margaret and I had spent years turning it around together. We added a small cafe corner in the back. We started hosting local author nights that packed the store on weekends. We built a reading program for kids in the neighborhood who couldn't afford books of their own. Slowly, the store stopped being a struggling little shop on the corner and became something the whole community looked forward to. We had loyal employees who felt more like family than staff. Mrs. Alvarez, who'd worked the register longer than I'd been alive. James, a college kid who started shelving books part-time and ended up managing our events calendar. Customers who came in every week not just to buy books, but to talk to Margaret, who somehow remembered every name, every birthday, every small detail about their lives. What I didn't know, what none of us really knew, was that Margaret had been quietly investing the store's profits for years. Small amounts here and there, put away carefully, compounding over time. She never talked about money. She never acted like someone who had any to spare. She just kept working, kept giving, kept showing up every single morning like the store's success depended on her personally, because in many ways, it did. By the time I graduated college, I came straight back to her, back to the store, and we built even more together. We expanded into the empty unit next door. We became known throughout the community not just as a bookstore, but as a place that genuinely cared about the people who walked through its doors. For the first time since I was 8 years old, my life finally felt whole. I had a home. I had a purpose. I had a mother not by blood, but by every choice that mattered. Margaret and I would close up some nights and just sit together in the quiet store, surrounded by shelves we'd built with our own hands, and I remember thinking, more than once, that I didn't need anything else. This was enough. This was everything. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning, everything changed with a single phone call. The call came in at 9:42 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the clock the second my phone started ringing, some instinct in me already sensing something was wrong before I even answered. It was Mrs. Alvarez. Her voice was shaking so badly I almost couldn't understand her. Margaret had collapsed in the store, right behind the counter, only minutes after unlocking the front door like she did every single morning of her life. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I remember running through the doors of the emergency room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, begging anyone in scrubs to tell me she was okay. A doctor finally sat me down and used the word stroke, massive, sudden, the kind that gives you no warning and no mercy. They let me see her for a few minutes. Margaret, who had never once in 16 years looked anything less than strong, lay in that hospital bed looking impossibly small. Machines beeped steadily around her. Her hand, when I held it, felt cold in a way I'd never known her hands to feel. She opened her eyes once. Just once. And even then, even with everything failing inside her, she still found the strength to squeeze my hand and give me the smallest, faintest smile, like she was the one comforting me, not the other way around. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. 16 years of love doesn't need a final sentence to make itself understood. She was gone before sunset. I don't remember much about the days that followed. I remember the funeral more clearly than I'd like to. Hundreds of people came. Customers, neighbors, people whose names I didn't even know, all standing shoulder to shoulder because Margaret Lawson had touched every single one of their lives in some small, quiet way. The line to pay respects stretched around the block. And then, near the back of the crowd, I saw them. Two faces I hadn't seen in 16 years. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably them. My mother's eyes met mine for just a second before she looked away. My father stood a little behind her, hands in his pockets, watching everything unfold with an expression I couldn't quite read. I started walking toward them. I don't even know what I intended to say, but by the time I reached the spot where they'd been standing, they were already gone. Vanished into the crowd like they'd never been there at all. I told myself I imagined it. Grief plays tricks on people, I reasoned. But deep down, I knew what I saw. And deep down, some small, exhausted part of me couldn't stop wondering, why now? Why, after 16 years of silence, would they choose to appear at Margaret's funeral of all places? I didn't have time to sit with that question. Grief swallowed everything else whole in the days that followed. 4 days later, I learned Margaret had left me far more than a bookstore, and someone else had already found out. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and coffee. I sat across from a man named Mr. Whitfield, who Margaret had apparently trusted with everything for over a decade, and listened as he read through a will I didn't even know existed in that much detail. Margaret hadn't just left me a bookstore. She'd left me 3 commercial properties she'd quietly purchased over the years. A modest but very real investment portfolio she'd built patiently, without ever once mentioning it to me. Enough, altogether, to change the entire trajectory of my life. Mr. Whitfield explained it plainly. Margaret had left everything, every last cent, every property, every share, to me. No conditions. No strings. Just a note attached to the will that read, "You'll protect what we built better than anyone else ever could." I sat there in stunned silence, grief and shock tangled together so tightly I couldn't separate them. Before I could even stand up to leave, the office door opened. My parents walked in. Older, grayer, but exactly as I remembered from the funeral, except this time, they weren't hiding at the back of a crowd. They were standing right in front of me, and my mother was already crying before she said a single word. "We never stopped loving you," she said. "Not for one single day." My father stepped forward and pulled me into a hug, the first one in 16 years. I stood there, frozen, not sure whether to hug him back or push him away. Part of me, some small, buried part one thought had died a long time ago, wanted so badly to believe them. "We're so sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "We should have come back sooner." As he hugged me for the first time in 16 years, his eyes never met mine. They stayed fixed on the documents sitting on the attorney's desk. Before we continue, if a story like this one moves you, this is exactly the kind of thing I write about in my ebook. They called her useless. Until they needed her. It's a collection of 3 emotional stories about women who were dismissed, underestimated, or cast aside by their own families, and who quietly built something greater on their own, only to be sought out later by the very people who once wrote them off. If that resonates with you the way Sarah's story is about to, the link is in the description below. Now, back to the story. In the weeks that followed, my parents started showing up. Often. At first, it felt almost like a dream I'd given up on years ago. My mother would bring small gifts, nothing extravagant, just thoughtful little things, the kind of gestures that made me want to believe she'd been paying attention all along. My father started telling stories about when I was little, memories I barely remembered myself, filling in the gaps of a childhood I thought I'd lost completely. For the first time in 16 years, I let myself hope. Maybe people really could change. Maybe this was real. But slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, the conversation started shifting. It began small. A passing question about how the store was doing financially. Then another, about whether I'd hired a real accountant to handle all of this, gesturing vaguely at everything Margaret had left behind. My mother started asking, in that soft, casual tone she'd perfected, about the commercial properties, how many there were, what they were worth, whether I planned to sell or hold on to them. Every visit, the questions got a little bolder. A little less disguised as curiosity and a little more like an inventory. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Grief makes you suspicious of everything, I reasoned. These are my parents. They're allowed to ask questions. But then came the visit where my father finally said what I think they'd been circling around from the very beginning. We were thinking, he said, not quite meeting my eyes, since we're family again, maybe you could help us out. Financially. Just to get back on our feet. The room went quiet. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. That night, long after they'd left, I sat alone in Margaret's old house, my house now, turning their words over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself it didn't mean what I thought it meant. Then my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me to answer it instead. Hello, Sarah? My name is Rachel Kim. I'm an investigative journalist, the woman on the other end said. I need to talk to you about your parents. There's something you need to know. That night, I received a phone call from someone I'd never met, and what she told me made my blood run cold. Rachel Kim didn't waste any time. She told me she'd been investigating a case for months, an old investment fraud scheme from 16 years ago that had quietly resurfaced after a whistleblower came forward. She said she'd been cross-referencing old financial records when two names kept appearing again and again, my parents' names. I need you to understand something, she said. Your parents didn't leave you because of poverty. That's the story they've been telling. But it's not true. She sent me a folder that night. Scanned newspaper clippings, court filings, financial statements 16 years old, yellowed at the edges, but unmistakable. My parents had run an investment scheme that promised guaranteed returns to dozens of working-class families in our old town. Retirement savings. College funds. Life savings that people had spent decades building. All of it funneled into accounts my parents controlled, and all of it gone within 18 months. The scheme collapsed just weeks before they showed up on our porch and told me I didn't belong with them anymore. They hadn't left because they couldn't afford to raise me. They'd left because federal investigators were closing in, and a child would have only slowed them down. Leaving me behind wasn't sacrifice. It was strategy. A clean, quiet escape, one loose end deliberately left untied because an abandoned 8-year-old draws far less suspicion than a family fleeing town together. Rachel told me something else, something that hollowed me out more than anything. They never once looked for me. Not a phone call. Not a letter. Not a single inquiry to a school or a neighbor in 16 years. As far as they were concerned, I'd grown up with nothing, and nothing wasn't worth their time. Until my inheritance made the local news. I spent that entire night verifying everything myself, court records, old news archives, even a video clip of a press conference from years ago where a room full of investigators announced the names of the two people responsible for ruining dozens of families. My father's face, 16 years younger, staring into a camera he thought he'd outrun forever. It was all true. Every single word. I confronted them the next day. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply laid the folder down on the table between us and watched their faces as they realized exactly what I knew. My mother's hands started shaking. She reached for some explanation, some fragment of a lie to hold on to, but nothing came out. My father didn't even try. He looked down at the folder, then back up at me, and he smiled, slow, almost admiring, like he respected the fact that I'd caught them. You always were smarter than we gave you credit for, he said. No apology. No denial. Just that smile, cold and unbothered, like 16 years of abandonment and a lifetime of ruined families was nothing more than an inconvenient detail that had finally, unfortunately, come to light. When I confronted them with the truth, they didn't deny it. Instead, My father smiled. I thought the truth would end it. I thought once they knew that I knew, they'd disappear the same way they had 16 years ago, quietly, without a fight. I was wrong. 2 days later, my father called. Not to apologize. Not to explain. He called to tell me, in a voice that had lost every trace of the softness he'd used in Mr. Whitfield's office, that he and my mother were entitled to a share of Margaret's estate. You wouldn't have any of this without us, he said. We're still your parents. Blood doesn't disappear because you're angry. When I refused, he threatened legal action. A lawyer, apparently one they could suddenly afford again, sent a formal letter claiming a moral and financial obligation on my part, citing familial responsibility and hinting at a public custody abandonment counter-narrative they intended to spin if I didn't cooperate. Word got out fast. Rachel Kim published her investigation in full: the fraud, the missing 16 years, the timing of their return. Within days, it wasn't just my story anymore. It was the whole town's story. People who had lost their savings all those years ago finally had names and faces to put to the wound that had never fully healed. The community didn't hesitate. Former customers, longtime neighbors, people who'd known Margaret for decades started reaching out, not for money, not for anything, just to stand with me. Mrs. Alvarez told me something I'd never known. Margaret had once gone 8 months without paying herself a salary just to keep the store's part-time staff employed during a slow season. James told me Margaret had quietly paid his community college tuition for 2 years and never once brought it up again, not even when he thanked her. Piece by piece, I started understanding that the inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was the physical proof of a lifetime spent choosing other people over herself, over and over, without ever asking for recognition. My parents wanted to walk in and claim a piece of that legacy as if it belonged to them by blood. It didn't. It never would. Margaret earned every bit of it through years of sacrifice they weren't there to witness. My father, sensing the public tide turning against him, decided to do something reckless. He agreed to a local news interview, hoping to frame himself as a grieving father who'd simply been shut out by a bitter, ungrateful daughter. He sat in front of the cameras and, without realizing a reporter had done her homework, casually referenced getting back what was owed from money that should have been in the family generations ago, a phrase that eerily echoed the exact language used in his fraud scheme 16 years earlier. The same phrase 2 of his old victims recognized instantly and posted online within the hour. Then my father made one final mistake, and this time, everyone was watching. The clip spread faster than anyone could control. Within a day, it wasn't just Rachel Kim's investigation anymore, it was local news, then regional news, picking up the story of a man who'd stood in front of a camera and, without meaning to, confirmed everything his victims had spent 16 years trying to prove. 2 of the families he'd defrauded came forward publicly for the first time, no longer just names in an old case file, but real people with real faces, finally being heard. His lawyer dropped the case within the week. Whatever legal challenge he'd threatened quietly collapsed under the weight of public record and public opinion. There was no version of family obligation that survived what the whole town now knew. My parents left with nothing, not because I fought them for it, but because the truth simply outlasted every lie they'd built their return around. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel the satisfaction I always assumed justice would bring. Mostly, I just felt tired and, underneath that, quietly at peace, knowing I hadn't given away a single piece of what Margaret had built. Years passed. The store grew. I expanded the reading program Margaret had started, funded 2 more community scholarships in her name, and slowly watched Lawson's books become something even bigger than either of us had imagined back when it was just 2 people trying to keep the lights on. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. My father's handwriting, older and shakier now. He wasn't asking for money this time. He wasn't asking for a share of anything. He was asking for forgiveness. I read it twice. I sat with it for a long time before I responded. In the end, I wrote back one short message, thanking him for reaching out, telling him I hoped he'd found some peace of his own. But I didn't invite him back into my life. I didn't reopen a door he had closed himself, 16 years before I ever had the power to close it back. Some people mistake forgiveness for reconciliation. They aren't the same thing. I could let go of the anger without letting him back in. Every morning, I still unlock the front door of Lawson's Books myself, just like Margaret did for over 30 years. And every morning, I remember something she told me long before I understood why. Family isn't decided by blood. It's decided by who stays when everyone else walks away. The greatest inheritance I ever received wasn't the store, the properties, or the money sitting quietly in accounts with my name on them now. It was the unconditional love of a woman who chose me freely, deliberately, every single day for 16 years, when the two people who were supposed to love me first chose, just as deliberately, to leave. That's an inheritance no one can ever take from me. If Sarah's story stayed with you, I write more like it. My ebook, They Called Her Useless. Until They Needed Her, follows 3 more women who were underestimated, dismissed, or cast out by the people who should have protected them and who quietly rose anyway, only to be sought out later by those very same people, once they had something to gain. If you want more stories like this one, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.